Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the Anaplan API series, and in this video we're going to look at Postman. So as mentioned before in the previous video, Postman is a platform that's used to develop APIs and API calls, and I'll be going through what Postman is, what Postman does, and some of the features in Postman in this video. Within the Anaplan documentation in a priori, there is a specific area for exports and export actions over here. And that basically tells you what are the steps you need to do in order to do an export and download the export data into your file. So first of all is to get a list of the exports within Anaplan and from the Anaplan API. So the list of exports would come out as key value pairs. So export name and export ID. This is the URL that you need to go to that shows you the export. So workspace ID, model ID, and exports will give you that list. Once you have that, you can get the metadata for a particular export, but that just gives you a broader view of what that export is. So over here, it'll show you what the columns are, etc. with the metadata. At that point, you need to start the export. So basically, you run the export, and once the export runs, it will start the process of copying the export data into a file. Now, that could be a long or short process depending on the size of the export. And when you start the export, the API will return back a task. Basically, the task will tell you what the status of the export is. So you get the task ID in the next API call. The status of the status of the export is basically set by telling you the status of the task. So over here you have the task ID, and you monitor the export task, and it gives you the status of the export task, and it can be any one of these, whether it's not started or complete or canceling or cancelled. Once the task has completed, you can then download the export data from the file because the file has been updated by the export. But for that, again, you need the file ID. This is what happens potentially if the export fails. It'll tell you why it failed and give you all the errors. All the way down. Here you'll get the list of files. Like we got the list of exports, there is a list of files also in Anaplan. You get the file list. You look for the specific file that you are looking for. And then finally, you will download the file. So we'll go through that. You can download it as a chunk or multiple chunks. Right. So if we open Postman up, you can download Postman as a desktop app onto your PC. And there are some features that you need to be aware of in Postman. So first of all, there's this concept called an environment in Postman. And all an environment is a collection of variables. So over here, you can see I've made variables for username and password, also for workspace ID and model ID. There's also a variable for the Anaplan auth token, and this is the fundamental authentication method in Anaplan, that once you get the auth token, you can make subsequent API calls that use this auth token into Anaplan. So over here, you can see my username and password. They have been changed to the type of secret. So that's to protect privacy. But with things like the export ID and the task ID, I mean, these are also in here. And the reason why they're in here would be made clear as we go through this process. Right. So the first step in this whole process is to authenticate. And we authenticate, and you can see that here. This is from the previous page. Authentication is the first process, and then the authentication token is used for the subsequent communication with the Anaplan API. Right. The authentication service has a separate page within Anaplan, and over here it tells you what link or what address the authentication is supposed to go to. You can see the entire link over here, and that is put in the first API call in Postman. You put in the username and password as the variables. So when you put it within these two curly braces, it knows to use the variables in the environment itself. This is the address that you need to go to authenticate. And there are different types of API calls. The most important ones are these get and post types. They have subtle differences between them, but we are using a post for this. I think that would be specified here, where I'm supposed to use a post type of API call. So if we send this request to Anaplan, you will get a response that is shown over here, and that response is this token value. And this token value is given to you for every time that you are authenticated right within Anaplan. If you have put in the wrong username and password, you will get an error that says your login successful. Right, that is another tiny bit of code here that takes this token. So like you can see over here, the token is within this, it's called a dictionary. And within the dictionary, it's under this token info section, and then this token value section within that. And what we're saying here is we are going to set the environment variable that we have in the environment, and we are going to put in this authentication token as that environment variable. So from this point onwards, you can just update subsequent calls with this authentication token. The authentication token has a time limit before it expires. I think it's something like half an hour or something. But all of this, or this whole process should be a lot quicker than half an hour. So just to test whether this is working, I've just created this other call that just looks at the workspaces. It's not important for the process of what we are doing right now, but it's just to show that this token is working and we can get information back from Anaplan. So if I do that one, this just gives me a list of the workspaces that we have logged into. Right. So the next part of this would be to get the export ID. So when Anaplan has an export, when you create an export in Anaplan, that has a specific ID. You don't normally go by the name, you go by an ID. So this one over here, this API call over here, looks at the exports, and over here you can see the workspace ID and the model ID that we've put in the environment. And also the API call would be within the data. So over here you'd have this data. So the header section is all the data that is sent in the call. In this case, it's the get response. And within that, you have this variable for the Anaplan auth token that we've just created. So when you send that, you have a list over here of all the exports. So over here, you can see an export name and an ID. Anaplan is interested in the ID rather than the name over here. And right at the end, so this is the export that we want. We're just bringing in this export of revenue. This is the ID. And again, within the scripts, this tiny bit of code that says make the environment variable export ID the first and only export ID that's coming out of the response from the Anaplan API. Right? So we have the export ID. The next phase of that is to start the export. So we have the export ID. This address, basically workspace ID, model ID, and export ID and tasks, would start the export within Anaplan. Right, so these are the headers again. You have your auth token over here, and we send that there. It'll start the export. And over here it says the export has not started yet, but it has put in the trigger to start the export. And it also sends back this task ID. And we need to now see whether the export is complete or not. Now, the reason for that is there could be quite long exports with like massive amounts of data, and those could take some time. In this case, it's going to be pretty instantaneous because it's a small export. So, but before we download it, we need to check the status of this export and see whether it has completed or not. So from the task ID, there is this other API call to check the status of the task. When we go back here, this is also this bit of code over here that sets the task ID in the environment variable so that we can get the task status from this API call. Send that over here. And here it says that the task that we created has complete. So what happens when the task runs is the export is saved into a file in Anaplan. And you can see that in the actions files. So the export is run. All the data in the export has been saved into the file. And the next step is to download the file data. But before we do that, like the export ID, we need to get the file ID as well. And that's over here. So when you run this, you have a list of all the files in this particular model that I've built, and that's quite a large number of files. But the particular file that I'm looking at is this one file with the file ID of this. I've just manually set it as the environment variable. So the file ID is in the environment variables now. So we've done the export, we've updated the file, all the data is in the file, and the final step then is to download the file over here. So you have that here, workspace ID, model ID, file ID, and this chunks. So basically the maximum size of a file can only be 50 MB. If it's less than 50 MB, you can just download it in one chunk. But if it's more than 50 MB, then you have to loop through chunks of 50 MB in order to get the whole file downloaded. So we don't need to use that in this particular case. And when I send that, you see over here, everything's been downloaded. It's coming in as a text file like a CSV on its own. So at this point, we've built all the requests in order to do the process of downloading the file. And the next step would be to take all of these requests and put them into a Python script. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.